Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. How are you doing this evening? We good? Why don't you turn to the next person sitting next to you and saying you're looking beautiful tonight? Hey, well, it's not weird at all. Listen, welcome. You are so welcome this evening. My name is Dave. I'm the director of Kenilworth Youth for Christ, and I just want to say a massive thank you at the beginning of the evening. Firstly, to our guests, we've got Dr. Sharon Dirckx and Sam McKee with us. Sam's been in school with us all day today, blowing the minds of students and teachers alike, and it's been wonderful. And I'd also like to thank George and the family here at URC for hosting this evening tonight. This is the first of, hopefully, many events of its kind that we can do, because we really want to be a blessing not only to our local community, but also to the wider churches here in Kenilworth. And perhaps you've come here tonight with many questions. Maybe you're a believer already. Maybe you're a skeptic. You're curious, and you're just interested in this subject tonight. Well, you're in for a treat, and I'm really excited to share a little bit more about what we do as KYFC at the end. But without any further ado, please welcome to the stage Dr. Sharon Dirckx and Sam McKee.
Yes, so it's wonderful. Thank you very much, Kenilworth Youth for Christ, for hosting this discussion here today for the church in the area. What we will do is we will have a 45-minute discussion. We'll hear all about Dr. Sharon Dirckx and her work, her books, and all of that. Then there'll be a short break for you to think of your questions, use the bathroom, get tea or coffee or whatever it is you want. And then we will take your questions. So I'm hoping that you'll have your best questions ready and that you'll be thinking a great deal. And we look forward to seeing what you say. And then afterwards, Sharon's books will be available to buy at the end. And if you wanted to sign any, I'm sure she'll be happy to do that as well. And it's never too early to buy Christmas presents. So if you want to buy 2 books, do go ahead. Thank you. So, without further ado, right. Thank you and welcome to Kenilworth, Dr. Sharon Dirckx. I've known you for a little while now. It's always been a pleasure working for you. It's working now, yeah. Well done, Dave. You can tell he's a musician, can't you?
You can tell that we've done loads of these events before.
Would you mind telling us something of your background and how it was you came to first believe in Christ? Did you have a Christian background growing up, and what was that journey like?
Thank you for coming this evening. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and I look forward to taking questions from you later on as well. So my background is that I grew up in what I describe as a religiously neutral home. We didn't really talk about faith. I probably would describe myself as an agnostic, pretty kind of friendly one. I didn't really know what I believed, I guess. I didn't really think about it. But what I did know was that I loved science. Even from around sort of 13 or 14, I decided I wanted to do a PhD of some sort in the sciences. And I went into sort of STEM subject, A-levels. So I loved science. My biology teacher gave me a copy of a book called The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins, which I kind of read as a 17-year-old and just kind of absorbed what this book was telling us, that we are just sort of material beings in a material world. And I guess I arrived at university assuming that science and God were in conflict, that were not compatible. And actually in my very first week, so I was studying biochemistry, and it was at Bristol. In my very first week, I was invited to an event called Guerrilla Christian, which is not to do with barbecuing. There were four Christians in a row, and they were taking questions from the floor, and the room was full. And so I was listening to lots of other questions during the evening. And eventually I plucked up courage, put my own hand up and asked the question, surely you can't believe in God and be a credible scientist at the same time? And I was given the answer, essentially, yes, you can. That I wasn't given this particular part of the answer, but it was essentially this. Look, if we, asking someone to choose between science and God is a bit like asking someone to choose between these two reasons for Amazon and why it exists. Either because there's a website, there's a delivery service, there's a whole kind of HR and people management process and systems management going on, or because Jeff Bezos exists. And of course we all realize that those are not competing explanations for why Amazon exists. They together give us a more complete understanding. So I was given an answer that basically rocked my world, that I'd never heard before, and that opened a whole horizon for me of asking a lot more questions and grilling a lot more Christians, which I did over the subsequent 18 months. And also looking at the person of Jesus. Who did I think he was? Who did he think he was? Did he rise from the dead? Had he really come to forgive me and offer me a new start and freedom and relationship with him? So I spent a lot of time thinking about all of these things, and really I don't have a definitive moment, but it was somewhere around halfway through this degree, Easter of my second year. I had a few Christian friends who I talked to a lot. One day they invited me to come to their church, and I said, no, I'm not going to come to your church service. I'm going to write a biochemistry essay, but I will come to the student group afterwards. I have no idea why I said that. Anyway, I got on my bike. They went to church. I wrote my essay. Can't remember if it was even a decent essay or not. And then I got on my bike and I cycled to their church, and it's a bizarre memory for me, and it was kind of a bizarre experience, because who does that? Like, who goes along to someone else's church was a bit alien to me. I never quite felt comfortable in church. My parents didn't go to church. I was always a bit sort of on the outside. But as I was cycling to this church, I had this sense that I was being drawn into something bigger than myself. I was being drawn by someone bigger than myself. And actually the words that I put to that was that I was going home. And that actually is probably as close as I get to having a point in time at which I decided. But there were actually a few different points. I was a bit of a workaholic, and I really clung to some verses in the Psalms, which is a book of poems or songs about halfway through the Bible. If you open it halfway through, you land on the Psalms. And Psalm 27, the Lord is my light and my salvation, whom shall I fear? The Lord is a stronghold of my life, of whom shall I be afraid? There was a lot to be afraid of, it felt like for me at that point, and I was sort of suddenly had this new friendship that enabled me to not be afraid, and so that was a really key beginning for me. So that's a bit. There's probably more I could say, but yeah.
I'd love to ask, just off the back of that, actually, how was it with your family having become a Christian, with them not having any Christian background? And were there any points during your science studies where you did find any conflict or challenge, or how did you navigate that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, I think on one level I came home at the end of my second year. I'd also become a vegetarian at university, and I'd become a Christian. And I don't know if my parents just thought, oh, our daughter, well, it's just a phase, she'll grow out of it, whatever. I don't know. I did have some very interesting conversations with them. Obviously, it has stood the test of time. I'm actually no longer a vegetarian, although I don't eat a whole lot of meat. I try and eat a little bit less than I used to. But I'm still a Christian 30 years on, and I'm actually more certain of its truthfulness now than I even was 30 years ago. And so I guess maybe they've watched that over the years. I think that my mum actually now would probably call herself a Christian, actually, so she's been on a journey as well, and that's really interesting. And that we have the whole layer now of our children are now sort of talking, about faith with them as well. So you have the generational impact of that as well. So yeah.
Brilliant. So did you say you did biochemistry at university? Yes. What was it that made you want to go on in studying neuroscience?
So I did biochemistry, and then I graduated, and I'd written loads of letters to pharmaceutical companies. I managed to get an internship at Novartis, pharmaceutical company in Basel, so I moved to Switzerland for a year. And there I was able to do some MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, and I just realized that I really enjoyed the sort of larger scale approach of imaging, and that it enabled you to sort of see with your eyes. Biochemistry is a lot of faith in biochemistry, actually. It's about like pipetting tiny amounts of material that you cannot see, and you only discover 3 months later, if there hasn't been electricity cut, whether your experiment actually worked or not. I mean, a lot of faith is needed, and probably a lot of prayer as well. So, but I wanted to study something I could see with my eyes, and something that felt, I mean, lots of people are called to biochemistry, and they are to be lauded for it. I was fascinated with imaging and brain imaging, and so I got the chance to sort of have a go at some of it, and then I looked for a PhD after finishing the internship, which took me to Cambridge, where I got into brain imaging. Of course, now it's actually a very trendy area of research. I think this ability to look inside the human body without cutting into it really has transformed the landscape of neuroscience over the last 30 years, has enabled people to look at healthy volunteers and compare them with people with disease states, and then look at the intervention of drugs and what in fact effect that has on the brain. Of course, lots of fascinating research was done before that, but I think brain imaging has particularly helped the field of neuroscience.
Yeah. So amazing. Via Switzerland, you go to Cambridge University, best university in the world, and you are doing brain imaging. Oxford. Yes. Sorry, Oxford is also good. Okay. I say wearing a Cambridge University tie today. But you're doing brain imaging, and you're publishing some academic work. Could you tell us a little bit about what it is you were doing, what your research specifically was, in terms that I and everyone else could understand? We'd just love to know that.
Yeah. So, well, my PhD, it's in the University Library in Cambridge. I do not recommend you go and read it. It was in the 1990s when functional MRI, so most people are familiar with MRI in terms of having had a structural scan, maybe of a knee or a shoulder. Functional MRI is looking at the activity in your brain. The blood flow changes going around your brain when you're doing different things. And actually, I was studying basically what happens when we change some things on the scanner, the actual machine. How does that influence the kinds of images that we get? So it was a very methodological PhD, and also hemoglobin levels and hematocrit levels, because it's dependent on hemoglobin and oxygen changes in the brain. So I was looking at that. So not that interesting, but necessary at that point. And then I went on to do a tiny bit of pre and post surgical mapping, along with some people in the neurology department, looking at how the brain reorganizes itself when a tumor emerges, and what happens after surgery when that tumor is removed. That was fascinating. That was very brief. And then at my postdoc, I went to the States, to the Medical College of Wisconsin, where I did a postdoc into human cocaine abuse. So looking at IV cocaine in cocaine users in an ethically approved study. I really want to add that. We spend a lot of time jumping through hoops presented by the US government to make sure that this is essential research, and it's ethically approved very rigorously. And so this was looking at cocaine and how that was acting in the brain using these techniques, and I was comparing, that sort of thing. I came back to the UK to a lab on the JR Hospital at Oxford University, 'cause that's where I live, looking at EEG, which is another type of brain imaging, and comparing that with functional MRI. EEG is very good at getting high, very fast images. fMRI is very good at getting very high resolution, how detailed images. So if you combine the two, you get the best of both worlds. So I was helping look at that.
Great, thank you. Did you learn anything particularly as a Christian? What was it like being a Christian, doing neuroscience research and studying neuroscience?
Yeah, so the one key takeaway from my PhD, so I was a Christian by this point, was this paradox, and I think sometimes if we're outside of the faith, it can maybe seem even more stark that God, if he exists, well, what is he like? And I think that the paradox for me at that point was that God can, because he's what's known as transcendent, above everything, sovereign over the universe, the creator of the cosmos, and yet this same God actually cared about me as I typed numbers into an Excel spreadsheet, and cared about the Excel spreadsheet. That kind of paradox of a God who created the universe, but that also cares about me, cares about every human being, including me. And that was the lesson that I learnt, actually, that he does actually care. And actually I saw some really concrete answers to prayer. Actually doing my PhD was hard. And I almost gave up quite a few times. I don't know if anyone's doing a PhD here. Just need that encouragement to keep going. It's a slog. I think it's like, maybe it's like 60% intelligence, another 60% endurance, perseverance. I'm not great at maths, anyway. I've forgotten what I was saying now, but it was just, I saw some really concrete answers to prayer, praying for help, praying for people that could come and help me make progress with my project, and those people really did come along. Now, you could say that's just a happy coincidence, but there was a former Archbishop of Canterbury that said, when we pray, coincidences happen, and when we don't, they don't. And I think that was, I began to learn the difference that praying to this God who is transcendent and cares about my life, the difference that made.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're working in neuroscience for a while, and then you make this career move into Christian apologetics. So could you tell us what that is, and what that work looked like, and how it was, what sort of things you got to get involved in?
In apologetics?
Yes. Yeah.
But I'm still doing it, it's not past tense.
Yes,
yeah.
of course, you're still doing it. You're doing it right now.
Yes. So, a little bit of the process. So I was doing studying cocaine abuse at the Medical College of Wisconsin, and I ended up having conversations with about 80% of my co-workers about faith matters. They had questions, and we went for coffees, and I began to realize that I didn't really know how to answer their questions. I think there were answers available, but I didn't really know what they were, and so I decided I needed training of my own. And also my husband and I felt that we wanted to move back to the UK, and all of those things combined led us to Oxford, where I ended up studying at Wycliffe Hall, which is primarily a place that trains people to be vicars, church leaders in the Anglican Church. But they were also starting a course in the area of apologetics and evangelism. And what that means is, apologetics is essentially giving reasons. It's giving reasons why Christians believe what they do. It comes from the Greek word apologia, which is not apologizing, although it might involve apologizing, but it primarily means giving a reasoned defense, giving an answer. There's a verse in the Bible that says, always be ready to give an answer for the hope that you have, doing this with gentleness and respect, and that word answer is apologia. So I guess I started out thinking about science and God, the most obvious one. I've also, you'll get to this, I'm sure, asking me about what I've written on, but speak quite a lot on suffering, why a good God would allow so much suffering. I also, my neuroscience background set me up quite well to speak into the question, are we just our brains? Which is a question that I found to be extremely popular. I was quite surprised on both sides of the Atlantic, actually. And then also later on natural disasters, which we will come to.
Yeah, and there's so much to get into there. So let's take these books in turn, because I'm sure they're going to provoke a lot of questions from you here. But your first book is Why. What was it that led you to write a book on the question of pain and suffering? And it's a very accessible book. I've read it, I've given it to friends, I've found it very, very useful. It's not a really thick book, it's a book anyone can read and access. So what led to that, and how you framed that book?
Yeah, thank you, Sam. I'm not a fan of writing thick books. When I pick up a thick book, I rarely finish it unless it's a very good novel. Anyway, I felt that it was, I want to share this with you. So there was a very specific, it was put on my heart that I was supposed to write. There was a period of time when my husband and I were sort of praying every day about something kind of very specific, and we were reading through this 40-day series. Actually, we didn't manage it every consecutive day, but we did. And there was one day I'd had an idea to write a book on suffering, so books on suffering often are either kind of dealing with the intellectual problem, like the philosophy and the theology of why God might allow this. But then there's the emotional problem. There's how do I actually cope with this in my life, in real life? And I wanted to write a book that combined those two. So I started kind of jotting a few ideas down. And one day I just ended up saying to God, I said, God, if this is just my idea, then let it just fall to the ground. I don't want to write a book that you're not interested in, or that you don't want written. But if it is your idea, then show me. Well, that evening, when my husband and I were praying, the reading that we read, one of the lines said, release the writer in me. It was the same day that I prayed that prayer, and for me, that was another coincidence, but actually one that I really felt was God saying, no, this is not just your idea, it's mine. And that I actually felt that all along about why, that God was really in it. And the other thing that happened during the writing of that was that my husband was really ill. In fact, the day that the book was commissioned, we were at our lowest as a family. I was in London. I was trying to get a new passport because I needed to go with my husband to Paris to get some treatment for something that he normally came out of more quickly. He has a very poorly understood neurological condition that most of the time, 99% of the time, we have a normal life, but every once in a while we don't. And the only thing that treats it is cranial osteopathy. Neurologists don't really know what it is. So he was, in this period, he was stuck, and we were trying to get him out of it. And the email that the book was commissioned came through at our lowest point. And I felt like it was saying, now write a book on suffering. And I think that has actually given the book a tone that enables you to give it to someone in the pain, someone in the valley, if they want to read, if they're interested. Of course, many people aren't. It's not until later that they're even willing to consider that. But I think it has given it a tone that is slightly different from just an intellectual problem out there. I was really feeling the pain as I was writing, and I think that made a difference.
Thank you. I really recommend it. If you've not read a book on pain and suffering, I really recommend you pick it up, or if you know someone. It's a terrific job. I've read it more than once, and I've handed it on to other people.
You're very kind. You should be getting commissioned.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Dave and I were in school today, and every time you're talking about the Christian faith, from students of whatever age and staff, the question of pain and suffering comes up. Someone wants to know about evil or suffering and pain. And you've got to imagine a lot of the time it's because they're going through something themselves or someone they know is. So could you, concisely as best you can for us, explain why you think the Christian answer to pain and suffering is the best one compared to the other worldviews, including atheism?
Yeah, and you raise a good point that it's not just the Christian faith that needs to at least attempt to answer it. All different belief systems ought to respond to what is the most universal of experiences that we all have encountered one way or another. And one of the approaches that I take is to say, look, if God doesn't exist, what kind of explanations are at our disposal? What do we have? And if God doesn't exist, then we would look to kind of scientific explanations to try and explain disease and suffering. Genetic diseases are just the way that they are because of statistics and the way DNA replication works. It can sort of go wrong sometimes, and even human behavior can be explained somewhat using our kind of biological background, our social background, our psychological makeup and so on. But the bottom line is, this is just the way the world is. There's nothing especially right or wrong about someone falling ill with something, or it's simply the way that people behave the way they do, and the world is the way that it is. I'll speak to natural disasters later if that's all right.
Yes, yeah, we'll do that separately.
And of course that on one level might solve the problem intellectually, but it doesn't help us with our intuitive tendency to get angry about the way the world is. When we call something a disaster, or when we get angry, we don't simply blithely say, oh well, this is just the way the world is, just kind of buckle up, stiff upper lip, on we go. We actually, we get angry, we feel raw, we grieve. And it's as though the answer that this is just the way the world is not enough. That's not sufficient to actually help us through the mess and grit of this life. And actually, to say that it's wrong is to make a moral judgment, is to say this is not right, this is not the way things are supposed to be. And it's a kind of a wish that things were different than they are. And it's actually the Christian faith that uniquely makes sense of that, because it says that the world and all of its people have been made by a good God. God can't create outside of his character and his nature is good. He's the ultimate standard of goodness. And he's created a good world, a beautiful world. But that world has also gone wrong somehow. We live, as my third book is called, on a broken planet. That it's beautiful and broken. We mustn't forget the beautiful side. But it's also very broken. And it's actually, the Christian faith makes sense of that. It says God has created this world, but it's also gone wrong, giving rise to evil. And that's the other thing, that we can't really make sense of the world unless we bring in the possibility of transcendent evil as well, which I think is a very important part of it. So that's the beginnings of an answer. The other part of it is that the Christian faith uniquely speaks of a God who knows what it is to suffer. We Christians wear crucifixes around their neck. Why? Because their God ended his days on a cross. We're approaching Easter, where we remember that, and that actually the Christian God knows what it is to suffer. He has come into human history, come alongside us, but has also suffered like us and for us. There was something that his death on that cross was achieving, a suffering that he underwent that is far greater than anything we could ever imagine. Somehow he was taking all of the evil in the world, if you like, into himself, so that evil doesn't have to have the last word in our lives. You can perhaps argue that in order to provide a solution to the problem of suffering, you need someone who understands the problem but isn't part of it. And actually Jesus meets both of those criteria. He understands the problem because he became a human being, but not one that ever committed any evil. He was the only human never to contribute to the problem of suffering and pain in our world, and yet he chose to absorb all of the mess, all of the grit, all of the evil of this world into himself, so that we can know freedom from that, so that we don't have to be sunk and finished by it. That for me is the uniqueness of the Christian faith, that there's a God who walks with us, who says, whatever it is you're going through, you don't have to go through it on your own. Walk with me, talk to me, because his death opened up the way to a relationship with him. He took evil, sin and death into himself, so that we can be free of those things and free to relate to God. I know this might sound a bit strange if you're not normally in church or a person of faith, but a friendship has been opened up, and that means that whatever life throws at us, whatever curveballs we get, there's a God who is with us. We're never ever on our own, and that's really unique to the Christian faith. I don't see that anywhere else.
Yeah, absolutely, and I'm sure we'll have questions around this later, but you write your second book, which really is bringing your neuroscience and your philosophy with apologetics together in Am I Just My Brain? So what was writing that book like, what's it about, and what has come to your work from writing that book?
Yeah, so I mean this book is addressing for my time in the sciences, I spent over a decade as a scientist. The presumed landscape is one of materialism, the view that matter is all that there is and all there ever will be, and is the only thing available for us to explain what human beings are, what the purpose of life is, why the universe exists, and so on. The presumed landscape is materialism, and that goes for questions of human identity. What exactly are we? Are we just our brains? And the reason why we're asking that is because some people believe that we are. You are just the neurons in your head. Francis Crick, famous for co-discovering the DNA double helix, once said, "You're nothing but a pack of neurons." Is that true? It has massive implications as well. If you're just your neurons, then anything you think, say, or do isn't coming from you. It's coming from forces beyond your control inside your skull. And so, what does it even mean? What does your opinion mean if it's coming from your brain and not you? Secondly, anything the things that you do, what do they mean? Can you be held responsible for them? Can you be, good or bad? And the thing is that, there are significant implications to this view, and not just for the neuroscientist and philosopher. which is why I thought it was important to write a book. Of course, we live in a world that assumes that we think. Brains don't think. People think. We've got this tendency to anthropomorphize the brain. We say, my brain did this, my brain did that. It didn't. You did it. Your brain is the mediation of what you were already thinking, because you don't just have a brain, you have a mind as well. There's something that it is to be you. You have a brain with neurons and chemicals and hormones and transmitters and so on, but you also have a mind with thoughts and feelings and emotions and memories. And the whole crux of the problem is, how do non-conscious neurons generate conscious you? There's a you that exists, and the you that's here today was the same you as yesterday, and you've got memories continuing from one day to the next, and there's something that it is to be you. If we put you in an MRI, imagine this. We wanted to do a study to find out what it's like to be you in a day of your life, whatever it is that you do. So we want to, find out what it's like to be you at home, with young children, or in the workplace, running a project, or whatever it is, wherever you find yourself in life. And we were to stick an EEG cap on you and measure some lovely electrical signal from your scalp, pop you in an MRI scanner, take some functional scans and structural scans, collect some beautiful data from your brain. Would that tell us what it's like to be you? Of course not. For that, what do we need to do? To find out what it's like to be you, we need to ask you. We need to ask you what's going on in your mind. And you see, there are many people, atheists, agnostics, as well as Christians. For this reason, they believe mind and brain are two very different things. And those that are saying the mind is simply the same thing as the brain, that's a minority view, but there are many that believe these are very different things, and therefore we need a more nuanced, a more complex way of describing human beings that takes account of this. And so this is essentially what Am I Just My Brain is about. And looking at some of the offshoots, religious experience, is that just brain activity? Are we free, or do we just do what our neurons tell us? What about the soul? And so on.
Yeah, there really are loads of implications to this question of am I just my brain? I imagine it's been a very interesting talking point for having conversations with people about faith. Has that been the case?
Yes. Yes. I mean, I think sometimes their questions really are starting further back. I think if, ultimately, the question, why can we think in the first place, is where I tend to end up with this question, because even if we end up with a very elegant neuroscience of the human consciousness, there will still be some questions that science can't answer and was never intended to answer. And actually, if God doesn't exist, how do we explain the fact that we are here as conscious human beings? Where do the most persuasive explanations lie? And if there is no God, we live in a universe that is not conscious, that doesn't have mind. And yet somehow conscious human beings have arisen from within this non-conscious universe. But if God exists, then we didn't start with matter. We started with a conscious being, actually a conscious community. Christians talk about the Trinity. What they mean is God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, that existed as a complete, loving community before anything material was made. And therefore that flips the whole conversation around, because we didn't start with matter, we started with consciousness. And therefore there's hope for crossing this chasm from matter to human consciousness. And so human beings, for them to arise within that kind of universe makes a lot more sense. And so I have found it to be useful and helpful in providing an argument for the existence of God, that actually, the existence of God, it helps make sense of why we are conscious at all, that we think because God thinks. We are conscious because he is conscious. On that level I've had some interesting conversations.
Yeah, it's and you've had some very interesting debates and dialogues on the radio about it as well. It's absolutely fascinating. I think it also really plays into this question of what it really is to be human, which so many people are asking at the moment.
With ChatGPT and
yes,
AI
with AI, artificial intelligence, ChatGPT, all of this going up. I found out yesterday, by the way, that Starship are launching their first rocket to Mars next year with a humanoid artificial intelligence robot called Optimus, named after the Transformer, the famous Transformer, who is going to try and do human-like stuff on Mars as a practice run. I thought, this is the world we've come to now. But then you make the move back to addressing some of the big questions of pain and suffering with your next book, Broken Planet. So tell us about Broken Planet, what it does. I was not really aware of any books out there that were just answering the natural disasters problem. But it's a huge question people ask about natural evil.
Yeah.
So what brought you to write that, and just tell us about it?
Yeah, of course, yeah. Well, so when I wrote Why, I had one chapter on natural disasters. But of course, there are so many different kinds of natural disaster. There are earthquakes, famines, pandemics, tsunamis, hurricanes, wildfires, things like locust infestations. But of course, I mean, natural disasters also encompasses all kinds of physical illness as well that we come up against. And so it deserved, I think, its own treatment alongside Why. I suppose I could argue that together they make they work well together, those two books, Why and Broken Planet. I forgot to say that in Why, the way I dealt with the emotional problem was to have stories of people who believe in God but have suffered greatly, and this is their story. And I did that in Why, and I've done the same in Broken Planet. So you have people that have been on the front face of earthquakes, someone that was in the Boxing Day tsunami. I realized how old I was the other day when I was speaking to university students, and realized none of them were alive when the Boxing Day tsunami happened. So if you are one of those people, I apologize. Anyway, it was the biggest, one of the biggest tsunamis that we've had in the last 100 years or so, and have a story of someone that was in the tsunami seeing the sea come towards them and somehow extraordinarily survived. And stories from Haiti 2010, that earthquake, which hundreds of thousands died. So it's a book that, again, is not just dealing with it intellectually. I do bring in philosophical argument and theology as well, and science and geophysics and so on, but also deal with the on-the-ground reality of natural disasters as well.
Do be thinking of your questions for Sharon. We will be taking a break in a moment, and then we'll hand it over to you for your questions. But I wonder if we can get a bit of a teaser, a bit of a, not a spoiler, but a preview to what you're writing at the moment and what we could look forward to with your next book. Can you just tell us briefly what that's going to be about?
Sure.
If you're allowed to.
I'm writing on the topic of spirituality, spiritual experience. I think that there's particularly in the younger generations, wanting to know if God is real, not just intellectually but in life. And so there's a kind of a case to be made for the ways in which the spiritual realm has been made very real to some people, and so I'm writing on that.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to that coming out. We've heard a lot recently in Youth for Christ about how, Generation Z and Generation Alpha in particular are much more open to spirituality than my generation and the others. They really are hungry. So I think it's going to be a very timely book, and I'm looking forward to it. Please could we give Dr. Sharon Dirckx a round of applause and show our appreciation for being here tonight.
Thank you all. We are going to take a short interval now, so do feel free by all means to grab yourself a drink and some biscuits. Just so you know, there is some toilets just at the back to the right of the hall. If that is in use, you can go around the side of the building, or I believe through these doors, and you'll find some in the building just opposite. Either side of the hall there are some extra toilets. So please take a comfort break, and we'll be back very shortly. Thank you.
Okay, I'm conscious of time, so we will start taking questions now. Are available. You can still buy them now and after the question time. But who has the first question for our guest today? We'll have a roving mic, which the wonderful Dave will walk around with and bring to you. But any questions for Dr. Sharon Dirckx? Yes, first.
Maybe can start. Hello, can start with. You mentioned obviously you've been talking to a lot of materialists in the sciences, and you mentioned there's a view that the mind is more than just the brain. Can you elaborate a little bit of some pointers of what you would say to a materialist, the pointers that are indicating there's more than just the material?
Yeah, thank you. I think I would start with this kind of phenomenon that philosophers refer to as qualia, which is a way of describing qualitative experiences. So, for example, imagine they're right, and we do live in a materialist universe of the forces of nature acting on matter, and it's a closed system, and that's all that there is. Describe to me the smell of coffee. Well, you might offer me the chemical structure of the volatile compounds in coffee, but that doesn't get you any closer to the smell of coffee. Or you might offer me, description of the physiology of it as you drink it and digest it. But again, beautiful science, but it doesn't get me any closer to the smell of coffee. And the bottom line is, if you want to understand what coffee smells like, you need to smell it. There's actually no other way of accessing that phenomena. And this is an example in its singular of a quale, or a plural qualia, and this is a way to describe qualitative experiences. And qualitative experiences are impossible to describe physically. And it's the same with that analogy that I used of what it's like to be a day, to be you, a day in the life of your life. Measuring your brain does not tell us the qualitative experience of what it is to be you. That these are, pardon the pun, but qualitatively different things. And so you don't even need to get into spiritual stuff to make the case that mind and brain are very different, and a materialistic outlook is simply not enough to explain that. And then the other things I would appeal to are the kinds of things I talked about before, that if you are just your brain, this has massive implications for whether we take people's opinions seriously. Is that coming from you, or is it coming from your brain? If it's coming from your brain, why should I read anything into it at all? And yet we do. We assume that the person is the bearer of their opinion, and therefore we have a conversation with them. We live in a world that assumes that we're more than just our brains. We do that intuitively, automatically, all the time. So I would probably start there. And obviously there are other avenues, and I'm not wanting to undermine any of the scientific explanations. I'm a neuroscientist by background myself. Of course, it's an incredible discipline to be part of. But there are questions that science cannot answer, that was never intended to answer. Questions like, why do we exist in the first place? What is the purpose of my life? Is there any ultimate meaning? And of course, if we live in a purely materialist universe, there isn't any ultimate purpose. We can create our own. There isn't any ultimate meaning, but we could create our own to get by. But we seem to live with this kind of inbuilt, at least longing for purpose and meaning, which moves people to try and find it in some way. So I think that I probably would start there by sort of saying, okay, what if we live in that kind of universe? What does that mean? what does that mean for us as people? And is that the kind of universe that we really live in? Do we live as though that is the case, or have we defaulted to a universe in which human beings are unique in some way, and in which there is meaning and purpose because there's a God who created it all? Yeah, thank you for the question. I hope I haven't been too rambling in my answer.
You said that consciousness doesn't arise from the brain, but we can see that with cases like lobotomies, that trauma to the brain can affect consciousness. With this in mind, how can you be sure that consciousness really can continue after death?
Yeah, thank you so much. What an insightful question. You're absolutely right. Most of the time, conscious states and brain states correlate. So the state of the brain parallels the state of the mind. That's what happens most of the time, which is why we see, child development. As their brain develops, they grow in their conscious awareness. Babies aren't aware they've got arms until they're like 3 months old and bash themselves on the head and wonder where it came from, And we see it at the other end of life, in normal aging, actually, but also in degenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and dementia. The state of the brain and the state of the mind run in parallel. But there are some instances where there are discontinuities, and even for there to be one discontinuity gives us pause for thought that this might be more complex than originally assumed. So let me give you some examples. One is there are a small number of adults walking this earth with 95% of their brain tissue gone because they had water on the brain as children, hydrancephaly, but they survived it. And if you look at their MRI scan, it's kind of black space and a little bit of brain around the edge. They're functioning adults leading normal lives. Now that's intriguing at the very least. I'm not saying there aren't neurological explanations, that neurons are very good at regrouping and arranging themselves, but it's fascinating. There's also something that people are starting to talk about called terminal lucidity, and this is seen in degeneration, where people in very extreme stages of neurodegeneration have a return to the self. It's almost as though the old person is back for a very brief time. They know who they are, they know who everyone in the room is, they're very lucid, they can remember stuff. And yet their brain is, very degenerated. So how do we explain that? Some people that would say you're more than just, if you are just your brain, as your brain degenerates, you disappear. But let me just say that again. If you are just your brain, as the brain degenerates, the person disappears. But if you are more than just your brain, even if your brain degenerates, there's a you that remains. And this is huge. It has huge implications for how we care for people in these stages. And there's an argument to say the neurobiology just masks the person. The person is still there. They're just limited by their neurobiology. I think we can at least see some hints that might be one way of looking at it, even from within neuroscience itself. And then, of course, there's NDEs. I don't know if you were thinking about that when you asked your question. Near-death experiences. When the brain dies, what happens to the mind? And there's now 50 years of data from patients that have been resuscitated from states of clinical death, where their brain has technically died, stopped functioning, and their heart stopped. While they're being resuscitated, they claim to have been vividly conscious. And there are various features of NDEs that you may or may not be familiar with. And, some might be fabricated, but there are some instances that seem to be very genuine. I just even interviewed someone last week that had a very clear NDE. And so if you are just your brain, we should not see this, that NDEs ought not to exist. But the fact that there are thousands of patients recounting being conscious when they're physiologically dead suggests that there might be something more complex to human beings, that it might be the case that consciousness continues beyond the death of the body and the brain. Now, I don't see them as a proof of God or a proof of heaven, but I do see them as a very interesting data set that at least fits within the Christian framework, much more than the materialistic one, because Christians do believe that the person continues beyond the death of their body and brain. And the reason they believe that is because Jesus rose from the dead. But he rose bodily from the dead. So it doesn't answer all of our questions. There's more to consider, but it just puts a little thought in our minds that maybe there's more to being a human being than just the matter that we're made up from. So I don't know if that's helpful, but thank you for the question.
So I bought all your books, Sharon, so you'd be very pleased to know. But when you were referring to the broken planet, my mind immediately went to thinking, well, that's only half the problem. G.K. Chesterton once wrote a letter to the Times, believed to be one of the shortest ever written, and it was all about the problem of what's wrong with the world. And he basically said, "Dear sir, I am yours sincerely." So has there been anything in research, or have you done anything on neuropathy of sin?
Yes, thank you for that. So before I get there, because you started with Broken Planet, I want to say that, the way that I approach natural disasters, but it also applies to other, human suffering, the things that humans do to each other, that there are human factors and there are natural factors and there are spiritual factors, and you'll see those kind of emerge as you work through Broken Planet. And so with the human and natural factors, I want to say that, for a lot of these cataclysmic events, the natural that's happening, the mechanisms are often necessary for sustaining life on Earth. So, for example, tectonic plate movement is needed to recycle nutrients from the ocean bed back to the surface. Volcanic eruptions release nutrients, and we know the soil around volcanoes incredibly fertile. A lot of islands have been formed through volcanic activity, the Azores or the Hawaiian Islands and so on. And these often serve a life-giving mechanism. And perhaps on their own, are they to be called a disaster? Are they a disaster if no one is injured or hurt by them? But human beings, for sure, have a habit of getting in the way and making the impact on humanity so much worse by failing to heed the warning signs of a spluttering mountain, or failing to build systems that will enable detection of tsunami, or failing to intervene sufficiently quickly to get people out, or all kinds of ways, failing to build earthquake-proof buildings. In Haiti 2010, so many people died, partly because of high-density housing, partly because even luxury hotels had not been built according to regulations. They had no steel rods in the concrete structure, which meant they just crumble, they just pancaked, as opposed to in Japan where they sway and people get out and actually there's very little death toll. So human factors undoubtedly make the problem much worse. One of the biggest contributors to that is poverty, which is human driven. So people in poverty are always worse off in a natural disaster than those of a better economic position. So there is undoubtedly a human factor, which again, I guess the Christian faith offers a word for that, a diagnosis for it, which you mentioned, sin. Of course, sin is a very loaded word. It often conjures up all kinds of images for us, and actually, I can't remember who it was that said it, but sin is ultimately a violation of purpose. It's a person not living according to the purpose that they've ultimately been made for, and is best fitting on them. There's really only one sin with a capital S, and that is the sin of saying, in the words of Frank Sinatra, I'm doing this my way. I don't need you, God. And of course that makes more sense from within the Christian faith than from outside it. But I guess, I don't know about you, but I look at the world and I certainly see the impact of brokenness. I find it more helpful to talk about brokenness with people that might consider themselves not to be believers. There's undoubtedly brokenness in our planet and in the human heart, in our very biology, in nature. It's endemic, and we're all caught up in it, which means when we get caught up in suffering, it's not a personal punishment to us, nor is it a judgment on a particular nation or people group. It's actually a consequence of living in a broken planet with broken people. Thank you for the question.
Why is the Christian view of morality, with good existing outside of ourselves, superior to a subjective view of morality, with humans instinctively recognizing what is preferable and unpreferable as our senses perceive to be so?
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for that question. It reminds me of, I don't know if, if you remember the riots that were going around the UK in around 2011. I was aware of an interview on Radio 4 of somebody who was going around looting in London, and they were happy to be interviewed about this. And they were like, seize the moment, every man for himself. I guess now we might say the words, my truth. I'm just going to go with that. And then the interviewer asked him, would he mind if his own home was looted? And of course, his response was, of course not. That's wrong. And that's the problem with the subjective morality, that when, we can sort of say, each person can just respond to the world, respond to what they feel to be intuitive. What happens if one person's intuition leads to something that's actually harmful to somebody else? What happens if one person's ideology actually is harmful to someone else, like what you saw in the Holocaust? That's, you could argue that was the kind of what they intuitively felt was the right thing to do, but it was incredibly destructive. And actually, the Nazi government were tried, but they didn't break Nazi law, but they were tried according to a higher law. And I think that's the thing, that when we start to get caught up in the consequences of somebody else's kind of moral decisions that bring damage and harm to us, we begin to appeal to a higher moral standard that sits outside of individual human beings and actually transcends them. It seems that any time that we rail against something and actually want others to agree with us about that cause, whatever it is, we're appealing to something outside of ourselves. And it's often only when we come face to face with that we recognize that moral standard. And I guess the Christian faith makes sense of that by saying that God is good, but evil also exists. And as on a transcendent level, but on a human heart level as well. And I guess, I don't know about you, but I only have to look at the news to see both of those playing out in very real ways. So I guess, one person's subjective morality is not necessarily the same as another's, and who should be considered right. It's almost like you need somebody outside of that in order to make sense of it. Thank you for the question. Do come back to me afterwards if you want to pick up that conversation. Yes.
Sorry, I am a Christian and everything, but as one thought I've had is, over the last few years, I did loads of stuff to the apologetics of the people I was in touch with, because I had a lot of friends who were atheists and doing a lot of what you said. But what I'm finding is, I have a few friends now, there seems to be a rise in a different thing of spirituality, sort of going of paganism, particularly, especially with the whole climate thing. And there's a group of people, and I find them very hard to reach because they will almost say they have a spirituality about their love of the world, but there's almost a deafness to want to hear of what they would call a patriarchal type of religion, and it's trying to get through. How do you answer those sort of questions?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. I think we need to recognize two things. I think we are in an age that is probably better described as pre-Christian, in the sense that some people have had no contact with the Christian faith at all. But there's also a group that has, and they're drawn to possibly spirituality, but there's also another group that has walked away from organized religion, and they still consider themselves to be spiritual. But they are rejecting institutionalized religion, and arguably for good reason. We have not covered ourselves with glory as a church. We have made many mistakes. We need to get very good at saying sorry. It's very hard to say sorry. And of course there are the abuse scandals that have come to light and will continue to come to light, I'm sure. And so some people have walked away from already something very broken, and so there may be something of that in their background. And I think that there are no easy answers. I think a lot of prayer is needed, that actually these things are won on our knees before they're won in any conversation. And I think it's a kind of coming alongside people as friends, taking an interest in their lives, and praying for opportunities. We have a lot of common ground. It's a very different place to say we're both spiritual, and actually not to be afraid. You know, I want to say the deepest expression of spirituality is to have the Holy Spirit indwell you. What greater expression of spirituality could there be? And actually, so that you know, maybe a scary option, but it also might be quite an attractive option, how you can embody that in an even greater way. So I think there's more creativity and thought needed about how we have conversations around this. I think it's a relatively new stage that we find ourselves in, with this interest in spirituality, but this rejection of organized religion. And I think we maybe also need to say Jesus wasn't religious either. It was the religious authorities that put him on a cross, you know. And so, there's a lot of work to be done there, but I think find the common ground, win it in prayer, or do the work in prayer, and come alongside people, ask good questions, learn about their spirituality, ask them more questions about them for now, and maybe once in a while they'll ask you something as well, and see where God takes it. Thank you for the question.
Any more questions for Sharon? Any more questions from the floor?
In that case, Sharon's books are still available. Can we give her another round of applause and please thank you. Well, I've really enjoyed this, and I hope you do it again here in Kenilworth, because these evenings are very, very good, especially for bringing people along who maybe wouldn't normally come to church, but might come to something like this and find it interesting. So it's a good thing to do. It's a great compliment to the Alpha course as well for churches that run Alpha. So thank you very much for coming out rather than watching the England game as well. So like there was an England game? Yeah, I didn't know that either. You can pick up Sharon's books. If you want, in the last 5 minutes, to ask your own question to Sharon that you didn't maybe want to put your hand up for, if you've got a follow-up question to ask, do pick that up. Otherwise, I just want to say, support Kenilworth Youth of Christ. We had an amazing day in school today, all day, talking to the sixth form, talking to the staff, talking to year 8, and what they do is really, really important. I don't want to embarrass Dave here, but if you do have a couple of quid a month you could give, do sign up at the back. because it all helps, and it's really, really important that the Youth of Christ centres around the UK get the support to reach the young people who are slipping through the net, because there's a lot of them. So thank you very much. Safe journeys home, and thank you for having us this evening.
Thank you. Thanks, Sam. Just to very quickly finish, just to say a few things. Firstly, if Sharon's books are all gone, you can still purchase them on Amazon or Eden. Probably tomorrow or by Monday, we'll also have put up a few links where you can do that as well. Sharon's going to be here for just a little bit longer, so if you do want to grab her for a quick chat, that's fine. Just very quickly from me, again, a massive thank you to everyone for coming. This is the first of hopefully many events like this that we can do. We want to be a resource to the local church, and also for anyone that has questions. We all have these big questions of life, and as Christians we believe in a personal God that wants to know you. So thank you for coming. Just very quickly, if I could ask David just to share the next slide, and thank you to David as well for doing our slides tonight, and the microphones and whatnot. We appreciate you, David. Thank you so much. If you do want to support the work of Kenilworth Youth for Christ, there is a little donation box at the back. Alternatively, we have a website. If you've got a phone and you want to give, you can just point your camera at that little QR code. Thank you, Rob, for telling me about that the other day. I had no idea you could do that, which is brilliant. Just to let you know very briefly about what we do, we've been in the town, Kenilworth Youth for Christ, for about 33 years, working with the local school, local churches, and part of our mission is to introduce young people to Jesus and to help them see who they really are in Him. And we're doing a bunch of stuff in schools. We run Youth Cafe with St. John's. We're doing different events like this, and we'd really love for you to partner with us. If you value events like this and the input that we're giving for young people, please do consider giving to us. But either way, we appreciate you being here, and please, one final time, can we give a massive round of applause for Dr. Sharon Dirckx and Sam McKee. Thank you. A safe journey home, everyone. Thank you.